My husband said, I need to sleep with other women to make sure you're the one. I almost argued, until I realized he already had someone in mind. My husband asked permission to sleep with other women over dinner. 3 weeks later, I was reading messages from the woman who inspired the idea. My name is Clara Whitmore. I'm 32 years old, and until a month ago, I would have told anyone who asked that I had a good marriage. It certainly wasn't perfect. Ryan and I argued sometimes, got busy, and occasionally took each other for granted, but I never doubted the foundation we had built together. That's why what happened felt so disorienting. When people talk about betrayal, they usually describe a single moment, a text message, a confession, a photograph, something obvious, something you can point to and say, that's when everything changed. For me, it started with a conversation. A conversation that sounded so absurd at first that my brain refused to process it. It happened after dinner on an ordinary Tuesday night. I was clearing plates while Ryan sat at the table scrolling through his phone. Nothing about the evening felt unusual until he put the phone down and said my name. Clara, can we talk? There was something about his tone that made me stop. It wasn't fear. It felt more like the uneasy sense that he'd practiced this conversation before bringing it to me. I pulled out a chair and sat across from him. What's going on? Ryan rubbed his hands together before answering. About us, about our future. My stomach tightened immediately. Nobody starts a conversation like that unless something is wrong. He took a long breath. I love you. The words should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like the beginning of a speech. I love you too, I said carefully. He nodded. I know. Then he looked down at the table. For a moment, it seemed like he was trying to decide how honest he wanted to be. Finally, he spoke. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. I waited. The silence stretched. Ryan eventually continued. You're the only serious relationship I've ever had. The only woman I've ever really built a life with. At first, I wasn't sure where he was going. Then he said something that made my chest go cold. Sometimes I wonder if that's healthy. I stared at him. What does that mean? He leaned forward. What if I've never really explored? What if there are things I don't know because I've only ever experienced one path? I remember blinking several times because I genuinely thought I was misunderstanding him. Ryan, are you talking about our marriage? Yes. What exactly are you saying? He hesitated. Then he finally said it. I think I need to experiment. The word sounded bizarre coming from a grown married man. Experiment. Like he was discussing a science project instead of a relationship. Experiment how? His eyes met mine. With other women. The room felt very quiet. Outside, I could hear a car driving past the house. Inside, all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Ryan kept talking. Fast now. As if he had been waiting weeks to get the speech out. It's not because I don't love you. That's not what this is. I just need certainty. I need to know that I'm choosing you because you're right for me, not because you're all I've ever known. The more he explained, the worse it sounded. So let me make sure I understand, I said slowly. Ryan nodded. You want permission to date other women. He winced. When you say it like that, how else should I say it? His jaw tightened. You make it sound selfish. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I couldn't believe we were having this conversation. Ryan, you're asking your wife if you can sleep with other women. He looked frustrated. You're oversimplifying it. No, I'm simplifying it. That was the first time I saw genuine irritation flash across his face. He didn't look guilty or embarrassed. He looked annoyed that I wasn't reacting the way he'd expected, as if my reaction was becoming an inconvenience. For the next hour, Ryan tried to explain why this was supposedly different from cheating. He talked about self-discovery, certainty, and how he needed to know he was choosing me for the right reasons. At one point, he actually said, what if exploring other options ultimately makes our marriage stronger? I remember staring at him and wondering how long he'd been planning this. Because nobody researches a topic that thoroughly overnight. This wasn't some random thought he'd had that morning. He'd been thinking about it for weeks, maybe months. And somehow, during all that time, he had never considered how humiliating it would feel to hear my husband explain why he needed to test drive other women before fully committing to me. The longer he talked, the more obvious it became that he had already imagined how this conversation would go. He didn't expect me to be excited, but he clearly believed that sooner or later I would agree. What bothered me most wasn't the request itself. It was realizing he'd spent all this time planning his freedom without seriously considering what I might want. Because it meant he'd spent all this time planning his freedom without ever seriously considering what I might want. Finally, I asked the question he hadn't thought through. What about me? He frowned. What do you mean? If we're opening the marriage, what about me? His expression changed immediately. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for me to notice. I folded my arms. You get to date other women. I get to date other men. That's how this works, right? The silence that followed lasted a little too long. Ryan eventually nodded. I mean, technically, yes. Technically? You've had relationships before me. I stared at him. So? You already know what's out there. I couldn't help laughing. A short, disbelieving laugh. The logic was incredible. Ryan wanted equality until equality became real. Then, suddenly, the rules felt different. I don't think that's how open marriages work. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He looked away. For the first time all evening, he didn't seem prepared. He seemed uncomfortable. And that told me everything. Ryan had spent weeks imagining himself with other women. He had spent almost no time imagining me with another man. The difference mattered. A lot. Eventually he sighed. I just don't think you'd even want anyone else. The comment sounded harmless on the surface, but underneath it was an assumption that bothered me. Ryan wasn't expressing confidence in our marriage. He was assuming I'd stay no matter what happened. That I'd absorb the damage and adjust. That I'd still be there when he was done exploring. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Neither of us had changed our position. Ryan still wanted his experiment. I still couldn't believe my husband was asking for one. That night he fell asleep surprisingly fast. I didn't. I lay awake staring at the ceiling while the conversation replayed over and over in my head. The more I thought about it, the less convinced I became that this was really about curiosity. People don't spend months researching open relationships because they're casually wondering about life. Something had triggered it. Something specific. I just didn't know what. Not yet. The next morning, Ryan left for work looking oddly optimistic. Before walking out the door, he kissed my forehead and told me to think about everything he'd said, as though he'd presented a reasonable proposal and was simply waiting for my response. The second I heard his car pull away, my phone rang. The caller ID surprised me. Claire, Ryan's younger sister. We got along well enough, but we rarely talked one-on-one. I answered. Hey. Her voice sounded cautious. Hey, you okay? The question immediately put me on alert. Why? There was a pause. Then she sighed. Ryan called me last night. My stomach tightened. Of course he did. What did he say? Another pause. Longer this time. Then Claire said something that instantly got my attention. Honestly, I don't know what to believe yet. He's my brother. But what he told me didn't sit right. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, because whatever Ryan had told his sister, I had a feeling it wasn't the whole story. And deep down, I was starting to suspect that the open marriage conversation wasn't the beginning of this situation. It was just the first part I had been allowed to see. Claire and I stayed on the phone for almost an hour. At first, I expected her to defend her brother. Most people would. Family has a way of making even obvious problems feel complicated. Instead, she mostly listened. The more I explained the conversation, the quieter she became. When I finally finished, she let out a slow breath. He really said all that? Every word. Another pause followed. Not the awkward kind. The kind that happens when someone is reevaluating something they thought they understood. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Neither do I. I mean, she hesitated. Part of me wants to believe there's some explanation that makes this less bad. I appreciated that answer more than blind agreement. It sounded human. Ryan was still her brother. Of course she wanted there to be an explanation. Unfortunately, explanations and excuses are not the same thing. Claire eventually said she needed time to process everything. We ended the call, and I spent the rest of the day trying unsuccessfully to focus on work. Every email felt pointless. Every meeting blurred together. My mind kept circling back to the same question. Why now? Ryan wanted me to believe this was about personal growth. But people don't suddenly spend months researching open relationships unless something pushes them in that direction. The timing bothered me. The preparation bothered me. Most of all, the confidence bothered me. He had walked into that conversation expecting a result. Maybe not immediate approval, but eventually. As if my role in all this was simply to catch up to a decision he'd already made. That evening, Ryan came home carrying flowers. The gesture might have worked under different circumstances. Instead, it felt strangely out of place, like bringing a bandage to a house fire. He handed them to me with an uncertain smile. I thought you'd like these. They're nice. I set them on the counter. Ryan watched me for a second. That's it? I looked at him. What reaction were you expecting? His shoulders dropped. Nothing, forget it. Dinner was awkward in the way only long-term couples can make awkward. We knew each other's routines so well that pretending everything was normal felt impossible. Conversation kept starting and dying halfway through. Work. Weather. Weekend plans. None of it lasted. Eventually, Ryan disappeared into the guest room under the excuse of finishing some work. An hour later, I walked past the room on my way to the kitchen. The door wasn't completely closed. I wasn't trying to spy. In fact, I almost kept walking. Then I saw him. Ryan was staring at his phone, smiling. Not the smile people give social media posts. Not the smile people give funny videos. It was the kind of smile directed at one specific person. The kind that happens when someone appears in your thoughts more often than they should. I kept walking. Didn't say anything. Didn't confront him. But the image stayed with me. The next morning, after Ryan left for work, I called Claire again. She answered almost immediately. Hey, can I ask you something? Of course. I hesitated, then asked the question that had been bothering me all night. Has Ryan ever mentioned another woman? The silence on the other end lasted long enough to make my stomach tighten. Finally, Claire spoke. I don't know anything for sure. That's not what I asked. Another pause. Then she sighed. There was a coworker. The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered the holiday party. Ryan had spent almost the entire evening talking to her. At the time, I'd joked about it. Looking back, I wasn't laughing anymore. My eyes closed. Of course there was. There was nothing special about coworkers. People simply spend enough time together for familiarity to feel like connection. What coworker? I don't know much about her. But Ryan does? I think so. The answer wasn't proof of anything, but it was enough to make several pieces click into place. Over the following week, I started noticing things I had previously ignored. Ryan suddenly cared a lot more about the gym. He'd bought several new shirts recently. His phone rarely left his hand. He started working late more often. Each thing on its own meant nothing. Together, they painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. By Friday, I wasn't wondering whether another woman existed. I was wondering how long she'd existed. That same evening, Ryan suggested we go out to dinner. The timing almost made me laugh. For months, he'd apparently been drifting away, and now that I wasn't chasing him emotionally, he suddenly wanted date nights. We ended up at a restaurant we'd loved years ago. Back when conversations felt easy. Back when neither of us was carefully choosing every word. Halfway through dinner, Ryan reached across the table. Can we start over? I looked down at his hand before looking back at him. What does that mean? It means I don't want us fighting. We weren't fighting before you asked to sleep with other women. His jaw tightened immediately. A nearby couple glanced in our direction. Ryan lowered his voice. You're twisting what I said. No, I'm removing the packaging. The waitress appeared before he could answer. Neither of us spoke again until she walked away. Then Ryan leaned forward. You know what hurts? I already knew where this was going. What? The fact that you're treating me like I'm some terrible person. I stared at him. The comment explained more than he probably intended. Ryan wasn't focused on the damage he'd caused. He was focused on how uncomfortable it felt being judged for it. There is a difference. A significant one. I set down my fork. If you don't want to feel like the bad guy, maybe stop doing things that require a defense. His face hardened. The rest of dinner was silent. When we got home, Ryan headed straight for the shower. A few minutes later, his phone lit up on the kitchen counter. Once, then again, then a third time. I wasn't trying to look. Honestly, I wasn't. But the screen illuminated the room. A message preview appeared. Only a few words. Not enough to tell the whole story. More than enough to tell part of it. Ryan's. Hope tonight went better than expected. My stomach dropped. There was no contact name. Just a number. The bathroom water was still running. I stared at the screen, then looked away. I wasn't interested in searching through his phone. If there was a truth hiding here, I wanted it without arguments about privacy, without technicalities, without distractions. The phone buzzed again. Another preview appeared. Thinking about you. 3 words. That was all. Yet those 3 words carried more weight than every explanation Ryan had given me over the previous month. A few minutes later, he walked into the kitchen. The second his eyes landed on the phone, all the color left his face. It happened quickly. So quickly that someone who didn't know him might have missed it. I didn't. Ryan grabbed the phone and locked the screen. Then he looked at me. I looked right back. Neither of us said anything. But in that moment, a question I'd been wrestling with for weeks finally answered itself. Ryan hadn't been researching open marriages because he was curious about possibilities. He'd been researching them because one possibility already had a name. I just didn't know who she was yet. I didn't confront Ryan that night. A year earlier, maybe even 6 months earlier, I probably would have. I would have demanded answers, pushed the phone across the counter, and stayed up until 3 in the morning trying to force clarity out of a situation that didn't make sense. Instead, I went to bed. I wasn't calm. I was exhausted. There comes a point where you're no longer exhausted by what someone did. You're exhausted by how hard they're working to avoid admitting it. Ryan slipped into bed almost an hour later. Neither of us mentioned in the messages. Neither of us slept particularly well. The next morning, he acted like nothing had happened. He kissed my cheek before leaving for work. Asked whether I needed anything from the grocery store. Reminded me about a dinner invitation we were supposed to attend the following weekend. Watching him perform normality after everything that had happened was unsettling. The performance wasn't convincing at all. Once trust cracks, even small things start looking different. A smile, A delay before answering a question. A phone turned face down on a table. You begin noticing details your brain used to filter out automatically. For years, I'd given Ryan the benefit of the doubt. Now those same doubts were standing in plain sight. That afternoon, Claire called again. I told her about the messages. She listened quietly. When I finished, she asked a question that caught me off guard. Do you think he's already emotionally involved with someone? I stared out the window of my office. Rain was sliding down the glass. I don't know. She was silent for a moment. Then she asked, Do you think he isn't? That answer came much faster. No. Claire sighed softly. I was afraid you'd say that. I rubbed my forehead. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I asked, When Ryan talked to you about all this, did he sound guilty? No. The answer surprised me. No. He sounded frustrated. That hit harder than I expected, because it matched exactly what I'd been feeling. Ryan didn't seem devastated by the possibility of losing our marriage. He seemed frustrated that I wasn't responding the way he'd expected. Claire hesitated before continuing. I hate saying this because he's my brother, but the whole thing feels strange. How so? He talks like this happened to him. I frowned. What do you mean? He keeps talking about how difficult this has been for him, how misunderstood he feels, how trapped he feels. I barely hear him talk about what you're going through. After we hung up, I sat at my desk thinking about that observation. The uncomfortable truth was that Claire was right. Even during our original conversation, Ryan had spent most of his time explaining his feelings, his doubts, his fears, his needs. My role seemed limited to understanding them. The imbalance suddenly felt impossible to ignore. That evening I got home before Ryan. The house was quiet. For nearly an hour, I sat at the kitchen table replaying the last several months in my head. I wasn't looking for evidence anymore. I was looking for patterns. And eventually one memory surfaced. A company holiday party. 4 months earlier. At the time, it had seemed insignificant. Ryan had spent most of the evening talking to a woman from another department. I remembered teasing him about making a new friend. He'd laughed. Nothing about it had seemed unusual. Now the memory felt different. Looking back, details that once seemed harmless suddenly carried a different meaning. The conversation, the attention, the energy he brought into that interaction. It all looked different through the lens of what I knew now. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I wasn't. But my instincts were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. When Ryan got home, he immediately sensed something was off. Not because I said anything. Because I had stopped doing something I'd done for years. I had stopped smoothing things over. People notice when you stop carrying the emotional weight of a relationship by yourself. He set his keys down. You okay? I'm fine. You seem distant. The comment almost made me laugh. Distant. That was rich. For months, he'd been pulling away while expecting me to stay exactly where I was. Now that I wasn't chasing after him emotionally, he finally noticed the gap. He followed me into the kitchen. Clara. What? He hesitated, then asked a question that told me exactly where his priorities were. Are you talking to people about us? I turned toward him. Interesting. Not how are you feeling? Not can we fix this? Not what do you need from me? His concern was who knew. That spoke volumes. Maybe. His expression tightened. This is private. I held his gaze. Our marriage was private. The moment you asked to bring other people into it, you made it bigger than us. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan looked away first. That was unusual. Ryan had always been confident during disagreements. Lately, small cracks were beginning to show. The following Friday, those cracks became impossible to ignore. Ryan was in the shower when his phone lit up again. This time it wasn't on the kitchen counter. It was sitting on the coffee table across the room. I wasn't even close to it. But the preview notification was impossible to miss. Can't stop thinking about last Friday. I felt my stomach drop. The message wasn't explicit. That was what made it worse. People don't send messages like that after ordinary workplace conversations. I stared at the screen. The sound of running water continued from the bathroom. Ryan had no idea what had just appeared. A minute later, he walked into the living room. The moment he saw the notification, every trace of color disappeared from his face. Recognition. Immediate and unmistakable. There was no confusion. No surprise. No need to ask who sent it. He already knew. And in that instant, before either of us said a word, I finally got the answer I'd been searching for. The open marriage conversation had never been the beginning. It was damage control. The real story had started months earlier, and whatever existed between Ryan and that woman had already grown far beyond innocent curiosity. When he grabbed the phone, I decided something. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my marriage chasing the truth. If Ryan wanted to save what we had, he was going to have to start telling it. And judging by the look on his face, I had a feeling that conversation was coming sooner than either of us expected. Ryan finally told the truth 3 nights later. At least he told enough of it. The conversation started because I stopped helping him avoid it. No questions, no accusations, no attempts to pull information out of him. I went about my routine as though I had already accepted that whatever came next would determine the future of our marriage. That seemed to bother him more than any argument ever had. People get used to resistance. They know how to fight back against anger. What they don't know how to handle is distance, especially when they suddenly realize they're the reason for it. We were sitting in the living room after dinner when Ryan finally put his phone down and said my name. "Can we talk?" The irony almost made me smile. That sentence had started this entire disaster. Now it was back. I set my book aside. Okay. Ryan looked exhausted. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't trying to sound reasonable. He wasn't quoting articles. He wasn't talking about personal growth. He just looked tired. "I know you think this is about Melissa." I held his gaze. "Isn't it?" The silence answered before he did. Finally, he looked down. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because every story like this eventually reaches that line. Nobody ever means for it to happen. Nobody plans to destroy their marriage. They just make 100 small choices that lead there. Ryan rubbed his hands together. I kept telling myself it was harmless. Then I started looking forward to her messages more than I should have. Hearing him say it out loud was painful, because that was exactly how these situations usually begin. Nobody wakes up planning to destroy a marriage. The damage starts with small choices that seem harmless until they aren't. He told me about the coffee breaks, the late-night work conversations, the personal stories, the growing attachment. Nothing physical, according to him. Whether that was true no longer mattered. The betrayal had started long before anything physical. It started when another woman became the person he was emotionally investing in while coming home to me every night. You were already interested in her when you asked for the open marriage. It wasn't a question. Ryan closed his eyes, then nodded. That was all I needed. Months of confusion suddenly became simple. The research, the podcasts, the articles, the speeches about self-discovery. None of it had been the cause. It had been the justification. Ryan hadn't been searching for answers. He'd been searching for permission. Permission to pursue someone else without seeing himself as the villain. The realization hurt less than I expected. Maybe because I'd already known. Maybe because part of me had accepted it the moment I saw the messages. Ryan looked at me. "I never planned to leave you." That sentence bothered me more than anything else he'd said, because he genuinely believed it helped. He genuinely thought it proved something. Instead, it revealed the real problem. "You wanted both." His eyes dropped immediately. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us. Finally, I continued. "You wanted the safety of your marriage and the excitement of someone new." Ryan didn't argue, because he couldn't. That was exactly what had happened. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he asked the question he'd been avoiding. "What happens now?" I looked around the room, the house we'd built together, the furniture we'd chosen, the photographs on the walls, the ordinary life I used to think was permanent. Then I looked back at him. And for the first time since this began, I knew exactly what I wanted. "I think we're done." Ryan stared at me, like he genuinely hadn't expected the words. Even after everything. Even after Melissa. Even after the open marriage conversation. Part of him had still believed I'd stay. That realization seemed to hit him all at once. His face changed. I watched his expression change as the reality finally settled in. The confidence he'd carried for weeks disappeared, replaced by the fear of losing something he had assumed would always be there. "Clara?" I shook my head. "No." His voice cracked slightly. "We can fix this." The sad part was that he meant it. Now that consequences were real, he wanted to fix everything. Now that I was walking away, he suddenly remembered how much I mattered. But timing matters. And some lessons arrive after the opportunity to use them has already passed. For weeks, Ryan had treated our marriage like a safety net, something that would still be waiting after he finished figuring himself out. Now he was learning something people often learn too late. The people who love you are not guaranteed to stay forever. Eventually, they reach a limit. Eventually, they stop making excuses. Eventually, they choose themselves. The divorce process wasn't dramatic. A few months later, Claire told me Melissa had ended things too. Apparently, once Melissa learned Ryan had tried to keep his marriage while pursuing her, she wanted no part of it. In the end, Ryan lost both relationships. The irony was hard to miss. The woman he risked his marriage for walked away for the exact same reason I did. Neither of us trusted him anymore. There were no screaming matches, no scenes on front lawns, no movie-style confrontations, just paperwork, meetings, conversations neither of us wanted to have. Claire remained in contact with me through all of it. Not because she chose sides, because she knew her brother had made the choices that brought us there. Sometime after the divorce was finalized, she admitted something. "I think he believed you'd never leave." I smiled sadly. "So do I." That was the real tragedy. Not Melissa. Not the texts. Not even the open marriage conversation. The tragedy was that Ryan treated our marriage like something that would always be there. He assumed my love was permanent, no matter what choices he made. And people have a dangerous habit of taking things for granted when they believe they'll always be there. The last time I saw Ryan was at a coffee shop nearly a year later. We talked for 15 minutes, mostly about work, family, life, nothing important. He didn't look older physically, but there was a weariness about him that hadn't been there before. When we stood to leave, he hesitated. Then he said something I'd waited a long time to hear. I was selfish. It was simple, honest, and long overdue. I nodded. I know. There wasn't much else to say. We walked in opposite directions. A year earlier, the idea of losing my marriage would have terrified me. Walking away from that coffee shop, I realized something unexpected. I hadn't lost my future. I'd only lost the version of it that depended on Ryan. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at peace. Because losing my marriage wasn't the hardest part of the story. The person I trusted most had started drifting away long before he finally admitted it. What surprised me was that once I accepted that truth, moving forward became easier than I ever imagined. I no longer needed Ryan to come back because I had already built a life that didn't depend on him. And in the end, that was the thing Ryan never saw coming.